concerto is a piece for a solo instrument, or perhaps a small group of solo instruments, accompanied by an orchestra. Most concerti, you can say concertos, but concerti is the proper Italian plural, have 3 movements. The first and third are usually fast, and the second movement is slow. One of the main ideas of a concerto is to show off the solo player. So the solo part will usually be virtuosic. The relationship between the soloist and the orchestra is very important. Sometimes the orchestra will have the main melody, and sometimes it will have an accompanying role. When the orchestra is playing all together, this is called a tutti section. Of course, it's very important that the soloist doesn't get drowned out by the orchestra, so the composer has to be very aware of texture and dynamics during the solo sections, as well as the technical capabilities of the solo instrument. The Baroque period lasted from roughly 1600 to 1750. Composers from the Baroque period who wrote concerti include J.S. Bach, Corelli and Vivaldi. The music you can hear now is Vivaldi's concerto for 2 mandolins. The concerto grosso was very popular in the Baroque period. This is where there is a small group of soloists, in this concerto the 2 mandolins. The group of soloists is called the concertino, while the accompanying orchestra is called the ripieno. The orchestra in the Baroque period was small and dominated by strings. The things that are always present in the Baroque orchestra are the strings and the continuo. It's important to understand that the continuo isn't an instrument. It's a combination of a chordal part, normally played by a harpsichord, and a bass line, usually played by a cello. Continuo is actually short for basso continuo, which means continuous bass line. The sound of the harpsichord is very distinctive and cuts through the sound of the orchestra. It's one of the characteristic sounds of Baroque music. The solo instruments most likely to be included in a Baroque concerto are violin, cello, harpsichord and recorder, with oboe and flute sometimes being used. Bear in mind that the clarinet and the piano weren't invented in the Baroque period, so you definitely won't hear those in a Baroque piece. Melodies in the Baroque period were often highly ornamented. In this movement from Spring by Vivaldi, you can hear plentiful use of trills and mordants. A mordant is like a mini trill, with only one wiggle between the notes. Most of the ornaments in Baroque music are not written into the music by the composer. It was understood that it was down to the performer to decide where to put them in. Another feature of Baroque music is terraced dynamics. This is where the changes of dynamics are sudden. The music is either loud or soft, and there are rarely any crescendos or diminuendos. A variety of textures were used in the Baroque period. These include polyphonic or contrapuntal textures, where independent melodies are heard together, as in this concerto by J.S. Bach. There may also be times when the texture is melody and accompaniment, as in this recorder concerto by Vivaldi. You can also call this texture melody-dominated homophony. Structures often have repeating sections. This is called ritornello form. Baroque melodies very often feature sequences, where a small melodic motif is repeated at a higher or lower pitch each time. The harmony is generally diatonic, that is, in a major or minor key, and based on primary chords. That's chords 1, 4 and 5. Music from the Baroque period usually feels continuous, as each movement has a set tempo and mood that doesn't change. Composers in the Baroque period were usually employed by the nobility or by the church. In other words, they had a job composing pieces that their employers approved of. Their soloists would have been musicians employed by the same employer. They wrote for the instruments available to them, which explains why you occasionally get unusual solo instruments. The classical period lasted from 1750 until about 1810. The orchestra in the classical period was medium-sized. The continuo died out very quickly after 1750, and the orchestra comprised strings and a woodwind section, with flutes, clarinets, oboes and bassoons. Timpani and horns were sometimes used. If they are there, they will play sparingly and usually only at the loudest moments. Nearly all concerti in the classical period were solo concerti, with just one solo instrument. Piano and clarinet concerti were very popular, as these were new instruments and composers were keen to write for them. Classical concerti are usually slightly longer than in the Baroque period, although the three-movement format is the same. Sonata form is often used in the first movement, which is based on two contrasting themes. The third movement is often in rondo form. This is similar to ritornello form, in that it has a section that keeps returning. The composers you need to remember for classical concerti are Mozart, Haydn and Beethoven. The harmony in a classical concerto is still diatonic and based on chords 1, 4 and 5, just as in the Baroque period. However, the predominant texture is now melody-dominated homophony. One of the characteristic things about music from the classical period is the phrasing. The phrases are of equal length and 2, 4 or 8 bars long. They often go in question-answer pairs. This is called periodic phrasing, although you can also call it balanced phrasing. Ornaments are frequently used, but these are usually indicated by the composer in the score rather than left to the performer to decide. Composers also wrote more subtle changes in dynamics into the score, and there was greater use of crescendo and diminuendo. The cadenza is a notable feature of the classical concerto. This is a section near the end of a movement where the orchestra stops playing entirely and the soloist has the opportunity to improvise a solo to show off their virtuosity. The cadenzas may have been improvised on the spot or more likely worked out in advance, either by the performer or even written in by the composer. This cadenza is from a cello concerto by Haydn and is typical of the classical cadenza in that it ends with a big trill as a signal for the orchestra to come back in. In the classical period, composers were mostly still employed by wealthy employers. However, by the end of the period, composers were beginning to work as freelance musicians and put on their own concerts in the concert halls that were becoming the fashionable place for middle-class entertainment. The Romantic period started in about 1810, and composers were still writing in a Romantic style in the early 20th century. Orchestras in the Romantic period were large. Valves for brass instruments had been invented, which meant that trumpets and horns could play more notes more easily. Composers liked the dramatic possibilities this gave them for their music, but of course had to compensate for the power of the brass instruments by having more strings, bigger woodwind sections, and more percussion. If you can hear really dramatic changes of dynamics, big brass melodies, a harp, or lots of percussion in a concerto, it's likely to be from the Romantic period, by a composer such as Tchaikovsky, Rachmaninoff, or Liszt. Composers and virtuoso performers were celebrities in the Romantic period, and going to a large concert hall to hear a famous performer play exciting virtuosic music was a popular form of entertainment. Most Romantic concerti are solo concerti, and are long and very virtuosic. Cadenzas are very important to show off the performer's skills. Piano, violin and cello are the most popular solo instruments. Harmony in the Romantic period tends to be chromatic. That is, it uses notes from outside the major or minor scale. The effect of this is lush and dramatic. Composers in the Romantic period were mostly freelance, relying on commissions. Often famous virtuoso performers would commission composers to write pieces especially for them.